Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're coming to you live in the Smithsonian Institution Archives Collection Processing Lab in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Nora Lakshan. I'm the Senior Conservator for the Smithsonian Institution Archives. We're here to talk about material matters in field books. We're the Preservation and Conservation Department, Collections Care, and we've been helping behind the scenes to physically ready collections for digitization and further processing to get them to you.
And I'm William Bennett, Archives Conservation Specialist. I'll be supporting our discussion of the way that fieldbook materials have impacted the way that they were used and how our volunteers are able to assist in transcribing them for wider use.
And we are also really interested in what you've seen physically in the field books. We see you transcribe, and a lot of the times as I've been doing research on these from a physical and material context to preserve them appropriately, it's really fun for us when we see commentary on splotches or rubbed out erasures or specimens found. So we're going to talk about some things that we see from a material perspective as book conservators that might be something that you might want to pick up on when you're writing in your notes field. Be sure to post any questions that you have right below in the thread, and our other wonderful helpers behind the scenes will be feeding them to us throughout the course of this interview.
We're also going to have links to some of the things that we discussed posted later on in the comments. So we're going to start. We had to narrow down, of course, because there's so many field books to choose from, so many awesome examples. So we picked 3 that we're going to discuss, and Nora will start us off.
I'm going to start us off with one of the earlier field books that is happily in the Transcription Center. Not everything we worked on has gotten there yet. So we created a little custom housing. This is one of our earlier ones by Constantin Rafinesque. There's been a blog about him in the Fieldbook Project blog, and he's interesting for so many reasons. But one of the reasons we find this journal interesting, and you can see as a preservation method, we put in little spacers to keep from these little pen loops from getting knocked around. This is an early journal, and about 1818, so it backs up a little bit in the century. And what I find interesting about it is actually what is called sometimes its commonplaceness. It is a blank book. There is nothing particular about this book that would say this is going to be a field book, with the exception of these loops, which may have been commissioned by the user. When one wanted a book, stationers provided lots of different types of formats of books, but this seems to me a special little deal, a little add-on, so you can both keep your pencil and latch your book securely closed when traveling at the time. Moving on.
Well, and so something that we often come across, these unusual features are difficult for us sometimes to handle in the context of preservation. As Nora showed, we had to create these separate spacers, and these can also be hard to describe in transcription. So we would love to hear from you, volunteers, who help on transcription, what sort of interesting things you have had to describe in the notes field on the Transcription Center. And so moving on to our next sample, this is, as Nora described, this first book is actually a commonplace book. This second one was purpose-made. You can see United States Department of Agriculture field diary with space for the name of the scientist, with instructions about how to collect specimens on the inside. So this is definitely an evolution in the way that field books are being created, with some more particular instructions on the best ways, best practices for collection of specimens. This one is also interesting and remarkable because there was an interesting question of how best to preserve and keep this for future generations.
I'm going to point to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a perforated page in the back, and obviously a perforation you would normally assume, yes, we want to tear this out, but that was never the case. This was never pulled out. This was intended to be used for correspondence with the home institution back here in Washington, D.C. When I had this book in my hands for treatment, part of the perforation had come detached. You can't see very easily on camera, but there's a very small patch of Japanese tissue there that's holding the part that had become separated from the rest. It's an important question that we have to take into account whenever we're working with materials of any kind, that we're trying to respect the original intent, the original state of these books, And even though this was meant to be detached, we've chosen to reattach it to show that it hadn't been separated by its original user.
Exactly. And this actually, this perforation and this right here is intended as a mailing label, not just for correspondence, but should the book be lost, to be sent back, care of the USDA. We've seen other field books that have perforations. They're top-down skinny structures with perfs like a memo pad, so you could tear away. Some researchers in the field might have used these as interoperable and interleavable notes, not meant to be kept in a serial order. However, they have, because back in the days of index card filing, they might write up one sheet on one bird and one sheet on another, and then reshuffle them according to characteristics. But in fact, then we found that research in the field did not tear it out and wrote in it in a linear style. And then those perforations cause a lot of complexities for us trying to keep that book together.
And so these processes and procedures about the use of field books is something that we've become very interested in, sort of alongside our preservation work. So we would be fascinated to hear from you guys in the comments what sort of instructions to the field book user, to those collecting scientists you've seen.
We've even seen write-ups of recipes for developing photographic film in the field. That's really exciting for historians of science and photography. So moving on, about the same period, we have another blank book, and this one, it's going to be a little hard to see. This one, just a little bit hard to see because you're going to see possibly some reflection. Because what we've done in this book, which had a very vulnerable cover, it's made of sheepskin that really doesn't have a lot of material integrity anymore. And I believe when we got to it, the sewing and structure had already been pulled, perhaps for photography or microfilm back in the day. So it didn't have a structure that we could really maintain. And instead, we chose to get a little bit experimental with our structures using a technique called long stitch binding. And so what we've done is we've actually created, there was not a lot of information on the inside leaf of the book, so we've actually created a wrapper of its original leather and used what we call a sewn boards binding structure to allow people to open it. And for the camera, for the imaging camera, this book now opens, well, I've opened to a blank sheet, so that's not very exciting, but it opens beautifully flat for our camera operators to be able to use. This is interesting. I've opened to a penciled page. I know these can be frustrating. Our camera imaging technicians and specialists are amazing at trying to get a good rate of contrast and resolution for you when some things like this are very faded. One of the reasons we reinforce a structure or create a new structure is to eliminate the shifting that can happen in our books if their sewing is compromised, because that causes smudges and loss of information. And I'm getting a little time note, so I'll say that one other intervention that you may have seen or do is sometimes we find materials tucked in and folded and scrunched up in our field books. So sometimes we might put it in a separation flag and house it together with the original book with a little note saying there's oversized material associated with this. And that way we protect them both. That paper never has to be unfolded and refolded again a million times. And we're just going to finish up showing you some cute little twee favorites that we love. This is an example right here. We've got three little beautiful little field journals. Their format is very wallet sized. You can really picture somebody taking this and sticking it into their shirt pocket. There are admonitions and instructions all over the place about not destroying your field books. Keep it somewhere safe. And what's the best note to take at a time? The book that's right there. So you can see how these were used through the field. And this has got this cool little, what did you call it?
It looks like faux crocodile. It's clearly like a normal leather that's been stamped with a pattern to look a little more, I guess you could say, exotic or unusual.
And this beautiful little red one just says memorandum on there. And it was a stationer's example. You can find them anywhere. But throughout our collection, we also find a physical record of where our researchers have been throughout the world, from getting when they run out of space in their little books, We've got a history of stationary binding, from the most beautiful commonplace book to a skinny little, tiny little 5-cent, 5 and dime composition book, and it tells a great story. So we'd love to hear more from you about it. We especially want to thank our volunteers who have joined us today and who have been so instrumental along this entire project.
Absolutely.
Our crew is really wonderful. If you have any questions, now's the time. We're going to have our folks feed us a couple incoming. I hope there are.
Yeah, so you guys found anything interesting, like any specimens, or what are some of the things that you may have found?
We have a few favorites. I love my snakeskin. Sometimes we found things just floating in the middle of a book, and I hear somebody from the lab call me over and say, Nora, I've got something, and lo and behold, we never expected a snakeskin, but you can find that just by a little search in the little search appliance in our transcription center. We chose to use an herbarium mount technique because it was already quite flat, and we used little bandages. Actually, in this little memorandum book right here, which is a very odd little size, it's hard to stick a whole board in there, and we have a very fragile specimen that we went ahead and put it in a little mylar encapsulation. This little flower probably couldn't even take the strain of little bandages next to it, because those little paper bandages with a little bit of vibration and shimmying could cut that petal. So instead, we've gone ahead and done this.
And we find specimens in a huge variety of our books. I had somebody come to me from our digitization lab this morning, unsure if what she'd found between the pages was actually part of the book, or whether or not it had been intended as a specimen. But it was a large insect, and so we just slipped it into a new Mylar piece, and it will be imaged alongside the field book.
Yeah. There's a great blog piece as well about one of our former colleagues found a long stripy hair, and it just didn't look like something that had been used to brush out dust, and she did some research into it and found that it was the rare, that it traced researchers' travels to an area, I think, in South America where he was studying at the javelina. So yeah.
Yeah, so we have another question from Aaron wondering, why aren't you guys wearing gloves, and how come we don't see many folks wearing gloves anymore?
That's a great question. You want to tackle it?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things to consider. First is that as conservators, preservation professionals, our hands are one of our greatest assets in feeling the strength and the qualities of the materials that we're handling. And so having these gloves on our hands impedes some of that ability to sense and feel what we're working with. In another way, books, paper, these materials that are being used for these collections, they have been proven and used over hundreds of years to stand up to the handling of the oils that do exist on our hands. Photographs, by contrast, those oils will interfere with the photographic processes.
Yeah, it's chemical interactions in photographs that we do worry about a lot. Also, I've shown you some penciled remarks, and pencil is vulnerable to smudging and erasure, as well as very brittle little edges of paper. So we do take care to keep our hands very clean, wash them up, dry them before we handle, and that's what we request in our reading room and reference as well. If, by contrast, there's a lot of photography in a collection, that's when we'll ask people to go ahead if those photographs aren't individually sleeved. But you don't know when you're going to run into them sometimes. I believe in the Ruffin-esque book, there's another box or another folder where we have our own photographs of the book next to it. So we kind of intermingle collections, and we ask people to be aware. And no hand cream, please. Generally, you don't find conservators wearing a lot of nail polish, because nail polish can streak on objects as well, or colored nail polish anyway. So I keep my hand cream for the very end of the day when I'm going home. Thanks.
Well, thank you all very much for tuning in. We really appreciate the heightened awareness that this brings to our collections and to the Smithsonian at large. Please do continue to follow along with us online on social media, on the Transcription Center, on our website as we post new collections that come in. Hopefully on the Transcription Center, some of these things might be making their way to you in the near future.
And because we don't have the luxury of time to go through every book, we're continually learning from you and your observations. So please continue to chat with us, tweet with us. We love it when something comes up and there's a question, and then we get to see the inside of a book that we may have only been addressing the outside of. Follow us on our Facebook Live, or our Facebook sequences. We'll also be posting a link to the YouTube archive of this little program. Thanks for being with us. And thank you. Have a wonderful weekend.
Take care.